just like to begin every interfaith dialogue with the disclaimer that the one thing common in all Jewish communities is that we never agree on anything. So that's my disclaimer, that what I say comes from Jewish tradition. It's steeped in my understanding of our texts, but that's not a guarantee that if you go and talk to another rabbi, they're going to agree on what I'm saying, the conclusions I've come to. So Jewish law and tradition commands us to sanctify nature, to be stewards of the environment, partners with God in protecting the world, and to appreciate all that God has provided for us, and not to waste resources or contaminate the world that God has given us. This is evident in our liturgy. Every prayer service includes a prayer over creation, thanking God for the natural world, the creation of light and darkness, the distinctions between day and night, and all of the wonders that we see in nature between a sunrise and a sunset, the constellations of stars, and a beautiful walk in the woods on a sunny day. So the love of nature is evident in our daily liturgy. And the starting point, I think, for this tradition is Genesis, like the starting point for everything. That's why they call it Genesis. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, as the 7 days of creation are coming to an end in the first telling of this beginning story, God tells the first humans to be masters of the land, which is often interpreted to mean masters in the sense that we are responsible for it, not in the sense that it's ours to do with whatever we want with. That all of creation culminates in the creation of humans as beings in the divine image. That God says, let us make man in our image, and then God makes man human. And so we are God's caretakers of the earth in that role. And then in Genesis 2, as the story of Adam and Eve really unfolds, it tells us that the text tells us that God picks up man from wherever he was created first and puts him in the garden. So there's a very physical act of setting Adam up to be a farmer in that sense. And when God tells Adam, behold, this is the garden that I have made for you. Everything that you see in it, everything that grows from the ground, you may eat of it, except for the tree in the center. What a trap that was. But the thing that often gets overlooked in that statement, besides the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is that God is saying all of the growing things you may eat. And to keep eating growing things, you have to tend to them. And humans did not eat meat. God did not allow humans to eat meat until after the flood. It's one of the commandments given in the covenant with Noah after the flood. And there's lots of Jewish tradition that all of the senseless violence that is sort of vaguely alluded to in the generation of Noah that precipitates the flood, that the way that humans were killing animals for sport and tearing the limbs off living animals and eating raw meat and all kinds of grotesque things, that was part of that senseless violence. So there's this long ongoing tradition that sort of flows from our earliest texts that God wanted us to be responsible for this earth and to treat it kindly, even as we are taking from it for our own sustenance. There's a story from the rabbis also that humans were created last so that we would not be haughty. So to remember that we are here to take care of the growing things and the animals and all of that, but they were here before us and they could survive after us. So there's a good book. It's not a Jewish book, but a modern academic book, sort of detailing environmental degradation and regrowth, that postulates that if humans were to completely disappear tomorrow without not a long drawn out plague, but just poof, we were all gone, it would only take about 10 years for all of our structures to start deteriorating and everything to regrow to the pre-industrial revolution stage. So we're not that important. In the book of Psalms, there's poetry restating how God gave us the earth for our consumption and care, and lots of gratitude to God for that. And so all of that's sort of the beginning. The key where we really start to get into Jewish law around what that means, how we take care of it, of the earth and everything, is a concept called Bal Tashchit, which means do not destroy. Tashchit comes from the same Hebrew root word for shochet, to slaughter. So it also has to do with how we kill animals for ritual, for kosher slaughtering, for meat. It comes first in Deuteronomy 20 when God is saying, when you enter the land of Israel and you will have to lay siege to some cities in order to take the land, while you are laying siege to cities, you may not cut down the trees. So even in war, and this has to do with, as Rashid mentioned, my undergrad thesis, that even in war, the environment should not be a casualty as much as can be avoided. In practicality in modern day, that's not how that works out, but theoretically, that's a Jewish value. And many rabbinic writings expand on this and expound on this, how else that should carry out, not to be wasteful, not to contaminate resources, things like that as well. And so in the early 70s, a new movement began in Judaism along with Jewish renewal, started by a rabbi named Zalman Schachter Shlomi, to renew not only Judaism as a whole, but specifically kashrut, so that how we eat animals in an ancient context was thought to be more kind, to cut the carotid artery, to let it bleed out quickly so that it didn't suffer. When all you had was ancient tools, that was the best that was possible for ethical slaughtering of animals. And now that we have all these other tools at our disposal and other ways to survive besides meat, eco-kashrut has kind of taken the next level, so that maybe only eat meat on Shabbat and holidays when you are commanded to make a joyful meal. Eat less red meat because cows take up so much land and water and release methane gas, and the slaughter of cows is really much more, or the processing of beef is much more detrimental to the environment than poultry, for example. So there's all kinds of new environmental movements in this vein. So one last plug I just want to make on that note is the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies is an interfaith institute, but it is largely run and funded by the Jewish community. It is in the land of Israel, but it takes Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians and all other international students with the idea that we have very limited resources in this world, even renewable resources. If we are not conscious of how we use them up or how we contaminate them, they will not be usable anymore. So we have to learn to work together to use them smartly, and so in this way, environmentalism can be a path to peace in that region. So that's our hope for the future.
So some of what I say may, at certain points, echo a little bit of what Rabbi Liz just said. So, I'm sorry? Okay.
Is it?
I thought I was using it. Can you hear now?
What's wrong with it? The longer one. Okay.
Oh,
Is this one?
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I was just saying that some of what I have to say may touch at points on some of what Rabbi Liz just said, so I'll try not to belabor those kinds of connections. We wanted to spend some time focusing on the Adam and Eve and the garden story. So Christian tradition has tended to focus on that story as the story of the fall, in our terminology, which was the tragic rupture in the relationship between God and humanity occasioned by the first couple's disobedience in the garden. And the basis for this is the New Testament letter to the Romans, in which Paul talks about this event as kind of an account of how sin came into the world and how God has acted to repair that broken relationship between God and humanity through the person of Jesus Christ. That's been sort of the traditional way of looking at this story. More recent Christian scholarship has really tried to take the Genesis text more on its own terms and not try to shoehorn it into a Christian doctrinal framework. So we have come to see this as a story as much about original blessing as about original sin. And I think as Christians have tried to focus more on what the story actually says, we've discovered some layers of the text that we probably didn't notice before, and it's still just as resonant, if not more so, for a Christian understanding of God and the world and us. So, trying to take the text on its own terms and with the help of some biblical scholars writing in the Christian tradition, this is what I make of some of its key features. I think this story, specifically the garden story, provides kind of almost a complement, or you could even say a counterbalance to the understanding of humanity that we gain from Genesis 1, which tells us that we humans are made in the image of God. In Genesis 2, we find out that we are also made in the image of the earth. In the second creation account, God takes a barren stretch of land, causes underground streams of water to well up, and then from the dust and water kind of finds the raw material to make a human being. The name of the first human, Adam, literally means something like earthling or groundling. And so God breathes the breath of life into the first human creature, so we are creatures of both earth and heaven, and that has some real implications. So what is the function of this earthling? And as Rabbi Liz has said, it seems to be to tend the earth. There are numerous translations for the words that are used. Till it and keep it is often one that is used. Work it and watch it. And the one I really like, though it might not be quite as literal, but serve and preserve it. That is the job of the human creature. So really, we learn from this text that there are three relationships that God has created. The relationship between God and human beings, the relationship between human and human, the woman and the man, and then between humans and the earth. And we could even say more specifically, the soil. We are supposed to toil for the soil because that is what sustains us, and only by faithfully tending it and protecting it do we have the wherewithal for both the necessities and really the pleasures of life. Food and clean water, clean air, clothing, shelter, all of the things that we need, and all of the things that give us pleasure and joy as well. And going back to the animals, I think the fact that Adam was charged with naming the animals suggests that humanity has a special responsibility toward them as their caretakers. So at any rate, the transgression of the first couple was really in not recognizing their human place in the scheme of things, and not recognizing their human vulnerability and their limits. I guess you could say their contingency or their dependence on someone other than themselves, someone outside themselves. I think it's worth noting what God says to Adam after the couple's disobedience in the garden. God says, "Cursed is the ground on account of you," which seems like a pretty strong statement to make. Why should the ground be cursed because these two people disobeyed? One American farmer had this to say about those words. He said, "If we are out of sync with God, then the soil is going to be the first to suffer." I thought that was really interesting. So, the Christian tradition has always had an understanding of the human person as both the glory and the central problem of creation, because we have so much power to do damage. I think more and more Christians are starting to grasp what I really consider to be the true biblical understanding of the world, that we really can't separate the material and the spiritual, that the physical and the moral and spiritual realms or orders fully interpenetrate each other, and the world is an interconnected whole, where damage inflicted in one place has repercussions throughout the network of being. And that's really, I think, kind of a description of what we now call ecology. So at any rate, I was asked to offer a specifically Christian perspective on creation care, or we might call it ecological theology. And I have to say that on the whole, the specifically Christian scriptures, the New Testament, actually doesn't give us very many resources for thinking about our responsibility toward the created world. And when I started looking, I was almost surprised to discover that, I guess. But the New Testament language about the created world tends to be very visionary and eschatological. For example, we have in the book of Revelation an image of a tree of life, which is planted by streams of water, and it seems to be kind of almost an echo or a mirror image of the tree of life from the Garden of Eden. And in this last book of the New Testament, it represents a healed creation. I think this kind of visionary language, as opposed to the really beautiful and majestic descriptions of nature as we actually see it, that we find in Job and in the Psalms and in the prophets, is probably because so many of the New Testament writers were expecting the end of life as we know it in their lifetimes. They were expecting the return of Christ. So there was just less focus on what we need to do in the world now. And I think another reason might be that Christianity was largely an urban movement. So the New Testament writers they didn't have the agrarian perspective that ancient Israel did. So all of this is just to say that Christian theologians today who are doing ecological theology are working primarily with Israel's scriptures. That said, we do have a few New Testament texts that I think are pretty resonant when we think about the interconnectedness of all species and the way that what we do affects the whole creation. Just as an example, the letter to the Colossians provides what I think we could call a deep ecological perspective, which is based on the idea that what is wrong with the world is not a technological crisis. The root of the crisis is in the human heart and human attitudes and behaviors. And in this case, I think human isolationism with respect to other creatures. Paul definitely understood not just humanity, but all of creation as suffering from the sin of Adam and Eve and their descendants. So, looking at the New Testament in terms of specific commandments to care for the earth, I don't find, a lot that's specific, but I think such a duty is implicit in the whole idea of living gently upon the earth in all our relationships, both to each other and to the created world, as Jesus taught. And also in all of the specific warnings and commandments against pride and greed and violence, which I think we can say have quite a bit to do with our current situation of environmental degradation. So we in the church do continue to look to the Hebrew scriptures for both vision and principle when it comes to thinking about environmental stewardship. And my own denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, has been quite active in both trying to develop some theological perspectives, but also to advocate for environmental stewardship with Congress and in some of the decisions that we make as a denomination.
Thank you. Peace. Can you hear me better? All right, peace to everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom alaikum. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the foundation in talking about how the Islamic perspective of caring for the earth. And if I have time, I'll talk about water, air, and climate change. And if I get the signal I have to close my mouth, then you can ask me some questions. Okay. So, and I also welcome peace if anyone's here from the Abrahamic traditions, those who strive for liberation and those who strive for enlightenment, and everyone in here. I welcome you as my brothers and my sisters because we come from one human family. Abrahamically, we say we all came from Adam. Scientists today say our DNA tells us that we all originated in Africa and migrated out in all directions, and so in a way we're all immigrants. All right, so I like to say a few words about who are the Muslims. All right, so I'm a Muslim, and Muslims believe in the God that created the heavens and the earth. The God of Abraham is the God of the Muslims. The God of Moses is the God of the Muslims. The God of Jesus is the God of the Muslims. So we call God Allah. And so today, I'll try to say God all the time, but if I slip and say Allah, you know I'm talking about God, the God that you already know. Our holy book is called the Quran, and it's a revealed scripture, all right? It was revealed, and this is what God does. So we're all monotheists in that we believe that there's one God, and God tells man and reveals to man about God and what he wants man to do through revealed scripture. He sends prophets from time to time. So Muhammad is the prophet that was sent to Arabia. He lived 1,439 years ago. And so Muslims, we worship God. We do not worship Muhammad. So our holy book, the Quran, tells us about God, that God is one and only. God is eternal and absolute. He begets not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like him. Further, it says, God, there is no God but he, the living, the self-sustaining, the eternal. No slumber can seize him, nor sleep. His are all things in the heavens and the earth. He feels no fatigue in guarding and preserving them, for he is the Most High, the Supreme. So he sent scripture to us, and in the Quran he talks to Muhammad. He says, to thee we sent the scripture in truth, confirming the scripture that came before it and guarding it in safety. To each among you we have prescribed a law and an open way. If God so willed, he would have made you a single people. But his plan is to test you in what he has given you, so strive as in a race in all virtues. I'm going to be coming back to that as far as us as a community of human beings. The goal of all is to God. It is he that will show you the truth of matters in which you dispute. Just a little more. And before this was the book of Moses. It came as a guide and a mercy. And this book, meaning the Quran, confirms it in the Arabic tongue and admonishes the unjust and as glad tidings to those who do right. And further in their footsteps we sent Jesus, the son of Mary, confirming the Torah and that which had come before him. And we gave him the gospel, whereas as a guidance and a light confirming the Torah that had come before him, and as a guidance and an admonishment to the God conscious. All right, so I'll be coming from this book, and it's a guidance sure for those who are God conscious. So in the Quran, it says, behold, thy Lord said unto the angels, I will create a vicegerent on the earth. Now the Arabic word that I'm using, the English vicegerent, and I also use the word steward, is Khalifa. And Khalifa, when we talk about Khalifa, we're talking about a deputy, a steward. It denotes that there's a universal human inheritance. But with this inheritance of being here on this earth and interacting with the organisms, there comes a responsibility, all right? So this idea of vicegerent or steward is very, very strong. So when we think about stewardship, that's the job of supervising or taking care of something. And a vicegerent is a person who's been delegated by someone superior to them to carry out a particular job. So what is it that he wants us to do? In the Quran it says, it is he who has made you his agents, inheritors of the earth. He has raised you in ranks, some above others, that he might try you in the gifts that he has given you. So we'll look at water. It says, and we sent down blessed water from the sky, whereby we grow gardens and harvest grains. And so when we think about water, water is something we can't do without. And as stewards, we need to be thinking about keeping the water. The water that we have here is all the water that we have here. It gets recycled. We're very fortunate. When we cut on our water faucet, we're around here pretty sure that we can drink a glass of water and we're not going to fall dead. There are a lot of places on the earth where people have to walk to get the water, all right? And if they don't boil it, then they're subject to all kinds of illnesses and diseases. And so in some countries, the mortality rate for children under 5 is very steep because they lack clean water. But we have clean water. And how can we, as stewards of the earth, it's our job to use the gifts. This is a gift that God gave us, blessed water. But we must use it in a way that will keep it clean and keep the recycling going. And so one of the things is we shouldn't be throwing trash in our streams and our rivers. And we need to keep an eye on our county and our cities about dealing with sewage. So for example, this is the Bay Journal. And just to give you an example, the Anacostia River, a lot of you know it's a very dirty river, all right? When it rains real hard, then the pipe that's taking the sewage to the sewage plant, they have overflow pipes. And these overflow pipes empty directly into the Anacostia, which then empties into the Potomac. And so downstream of DC, we are getting people who the water has high fecal matter in it and lots of bacteria and other pathogens. And so there's an article here that they're going to open up a 23-foot diameter. All right, that's like the size of the width of this room. They're calling it the Anacostia Tunnel. It's going to be 110 feet below ground, and it's going to stop 98% of the polluted overflows of the Anacostia River. So, who's paying for this? Taxpayers. But we have the same problem right here on this side of the river. Stovall, our delegate for Carterdale City, he had a meeting and he was telling us that in Alexandria, when there's rainstorms, raw sewage goes into the Potomac. And the thing is, who is going to pay for it? So this is something we as citizens, we need to think about that sometimes a little bit more in taxes is going to benefit not just us, but the organisms that live in the water. All right? So my mantra is reduce, reuse, and recycle. And so, talking about recycling, we have these water bottles, and hopefully, how many get their trash picked up? Raise your hand. Okay, keep those hands up. Of those who get their trash picked up, how many put out their recycle bin? Good, good. So I have, we take ours to the dump. So I brought my recycle bin. That's where our newspapers go. And so we have one for bottles and we have one for newspapers. But it's even better if we reuse our bottles. And I see the rabbi is reusing hers. And I have one similar to hers. This one is, it says it's PBH free. All right, and if you'd like a water bottle, it's got the MAD logo on it, so if you want to remember and come visit us sometime, you can. But we need to reuse, reduce. One of the other things I'd like to point out, plastic bags. All right, it takes them a long time to fall apart in the landfills. All right, but we can recycle them, use them over and over and over again. So I pulled this out of one of those little things I have in the house. But Giant Safeway, if you ask, they'll give you paper bags. Paper bags are going to decompose in our landfills better than the plastic bag. But even better yet, you can take your own bag to the grocery store. All right? Now, why am I worried about these? When they get into our streams and rivers and end up out in the ocean, offshore we don't see them, but they're sea turtles and huge fish. Sea turtles think these things are jellyfish, and they swallow them. And then they have digestive problems, which leads to, they literally starve to death because they can't digest this, all right? So, and they've done autopsies when organisms wash up like these sea turtles. What killed the sea turtle? And then when they do an autopsy and open up the stomach, they see that it's full of things like the plastic bags. The things that go on around the, 6-packs, when they land out in the water, then they get around various birds' necks. And again, it causes them to slowly starve because they cannot swallow a big fish if they can't expand their throat because one of those rings from the soda or beer pack is there. So those are physical things, but chemically, we need to be aware. If you do oil changes, do you take the oil to the recycle center? or do you pour it down the drain? Don't pour it down the drain. Don't pour it down the sewer, because it's going to pollute the water and harm the organisms that are in the water. Remember, we are custodians. We are stewards. Your lawn. Now, the county people who can come out and do your lawns, they say once a year, fall, fertilize your yard. But a lot of people get the Scott's 4-step, and 4 times a year they're putting stuff on the lawn. Too much. Okay? So I'm going to wrap up. I just want to say about lawn fertilizing. It goes, extra fertilizer goes into the water, into the Chesapeake Bay, causes algae blooms, bacteria. They eat the algae. Algae give off oxygen. Bacteria suck up oxygen. Now you have low levels of oxygen, and it affects the bigger animals like fish. So to end, I want us to think about this. God has promised the believing men and the believing women gardens with rivers running below to dwell therein, and goodly dwellings in the gardens of Eden. But contentment from God is greater. That is the great triumph. So if we're to look forward to gardens with rivers flowing, and we're supposed to be working toward getting there, shouldn't we try to make gardens here on earth?
We're live streaming to YouTube, so in order for YouTube family and communities to hear you, got the mic. So. My name is Ricky Grant here with Ner Shalom. And
Wait till he has you have the mic.
this is when you were talking about the waste in the ocean. Are you familiar with something? I heard something the other day about the Pacific garbage dump, which is
Circling around
off
Yeah.
the West Coast somewhere.
That comes
And it's
from,
just getting bigger.
and it comes, this is why it's important that we understand as we as human beings, Allah could have made us one people, but He made us different. He gave each group the law. All right? And so, and a path, which means there's more than one way to return to God. But we're here for a test. We're custodians, and if each one of us start with our kids and our grandkids, all right, and teaching them to be good stewards, and we interact with people from other countries, that's why it's important to have diplomats who are diplomatic, all right, so that, because all of the world isn't on the same pace as we are, but we have a wonderful opportunity. We're a big country. We're a rich country. We're highly educated, and we need to spread some of what we've learned. And so we're working with China, and we're trying to work with them as far as, in fact, the world, dealing with lowering down the carbon emissions, all right? We're trying to work with the world, the other countries, as far as fishing resources and not overfishing. And this thing about us, we need to get back to, because way back when, in the beginning of the country, we used things over and over and over again. And my parents came up through the Depression, and they would save the papers and the newspapers and take them to the junk pile. But yes, there's this circling, and it's like maybe a mile wide, of plastic and pollution. It's mainly the kinds of plastic. So plastic is a wonderful invention for the 19th century, but it's something that we need to think about as we move forward. And so some people are going back to paper. So when you have your picnics this summer, pick paper, all right? Pick paper. Well, if you're going to a picnic, if you want to bring plates and things that you can wash and take home and wash, that's even better. But if you're one of these people, I don't want to wash and carry all that load, then paper is better than the plastic plates, okay, that you are throwing away.
Recycling is definitely a good first step. I know here at Ner Shalom, I try to encourage more recycling, but we don't have one inside. Yeah, so I see a lot of people just throwing things in the trash because they don't know what else to do with it. Compost is another great idea. Going solar when it's feasible. The problem is some of those ideas require other variables. So compost doesn't really work if you don't have something to do with the compost afterwards. If you don't have a garden or the worms or the whatever to help break down the compost, then you just have rotting food stuff. And like, what do you do with it next? Solar is expensive to install. Over time, it pays for itself, but needing the capital up front to get it can sometimes be a block. I think the thing that we can do best as leaders of our community is to educate so that all of these practices are put in at home as well. That makes the biggest impact is that we are talking about it, and then you go home and you compost and put it in your garden and turn off your lights. I know that's a big problem in a lot of synagogues because many observant Jews do not turn their lights. You can't flick an electric switch on Shabbat. So for an observant Jew, you have to leave the lights on in the bathroom for the full 25 hours of Shabbat because otherwise they have to go in the dark. They can't turn it back on for themselves. So, you know, that can expend a lot of energy, and that's a problem, but that we really haven't figured out a way around that yet. Can you turn? No, you can't facilitate the electrical current coming on or off. I know that was a big problem at the Arava Institute because we also had a lot of students who had never met Jewish people before, so that concept was super foreign to them, and we're here at this environmental institute, and they really could not wrap their heads around the idea that this environmentalist would leave the light on for 25 hours once a week. So that's another facet of Jewish renewal, is coming up with like energy safe or energy efficient electronics for Shabbat, or things that just turn on and off on a timer, so you don't have to be responsible for cutting the current on or turning the current back on. It's just doing it on its own. I'm not doing it. So there's progress on that, but again, like, to get that installed costs money for a synagogue. So I know that's one difficulty that I've seen. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah.
So I agree that it really starts with education and just talking about the environment as a matter of concern for people of faith. Beyond that, recycling is probably one of the easiest ways. We have a recycling program at my church. One of the other things that I think would be great for probably most of the churches in the United States, and maybe most houses of worship, for all I know, that have been around for more than 20 years, could do with a comprehensive energy audit. And I know that I don't have the details or the particulars, but I know that EPA has had programs. I think the Energy Star program is one of them. I assume that still exists, where churches and houses of worship and other buildings can actually get some credits and get all kinds of breaks and perks and that kind of thing for having an energy audit and instituting some energy efficiency practices. So that's actually something that I would like to see happen where I am. What else? I hadn't actually thought about composting, but you're right. You need to have something to do with it. Uh-huh. Oh, well, I didn't know that.
At Darul Noor, one of the problems that we had that we solved is like during Ramadan, especially in summertime, people come in the evenings for prayers, and they're there oftentimes for a couple hours, and so people we had so people would be donating water, all right, like this, and then we had these bottles of half drunk water all over the place, and the officers decided to get we have water coolers, and now we actually this year or last summer we got the water fountains where all you have to do, and so this we got these last year. All you have to do is push on the water fountain and it can fill up your bottle. So we started now encouraging everybody, you bring your own bottle or you could buy a bottle. Today they're free. Okay. Bring your own bottles. We're not having plastic water bottles. So it's taken a while, and we have to remind people this year again, because this is the second year. Don't donate bottles of water. People can bring water bottles and fill up their water bottles. So that's one thing that we've tried to solve is cut down on the plastic. Second, we have some rooms where you go in and the lights come on automatically or go off automatically. If you're not there after a certain, say, 5 minutes, then they go off. Um, and we don't do, we have one sister who worked for the agriculture department. And so uh, we're growing this. Some students she gets together and we grow some plants and things each year. So we passing down that knowledge to our young ones because the little ones, if you don't take them outside, it's like have an out of car experience with your child or your grandchild. If we don't take them outside, if we don't take them to farms to see how things are grown, what they see at Safeway and Giant and all these other stores is that the meat comes in a package. There's a disconnect of where meat really comes from. The vegetables are lined up all nice and neat, but really we grow them. The farmer plucks them up. They get washed and all that and brought to the stores. And so eat locally here in Dale City at the commuter parking lot. We have farmers market. So I make it a point it just started back up to go there. It's on Sundays from 8 until 1 and buy you can get eggs, you can get fresh veg. Right now it's mainly flowers, but as the crops start coming in, you're going to get more and more crops. I think it's a good thing for us to buy locally because that keeps money in the local economy and that helps the quality of our life. So we do some things. We would like to do more. We're going to have an expansion, so I would love for us to think about, is there some way we can do solar? But maybe solar on the lamp post outside. So those are, it's a starting point. We're not like super green, but we're trying to go green. And we do have the recycle bins. And the company that picks up our trash picks up our recycles. And we thought we were going to have a concern because sometimes people put, it says bottles and cans, and over here it says paper and whatever. And, people dump food in there, but the people that pick up our recycling, they have some kind of system that can separate out the cans from the bottles, from the papers, from the garbage. That's on Saturdays. Oh, really?
If I knew the answer to that, I just think it's just talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. I mean, obviously, God has given us agency. I mean, that was even the word that you said, that we are God's agents on the earth. I don't really see how, it doesn't seem to me that it's that easy theologically or biblically to overlook that. So.
I belong to the National Marine Educators Association, so I love water and love to inform people all about ocean and water. One of the things I'm learning is that we really need to use words that deal with the here and now and what's happening. One of the things that's happening along the East Coast here and in the Gulf Coast of our country are we're getting more and more storms. Storms that are really dumping a lot of water, and so flooding is increasing. So we need to talk about what's happening locally, not necessarily globally, so they can see, well, how are we have these floods, and so let's take, for example, when the Hurricane Katrina to New Orleans. Well, one of the things that man has done, and we've done it in the Washington area too, is that we've taken away the marshes. And we need to start putting back and restoring the natural habitats. We took away the marshes, put soil down so we could build more houses. All right? So when the marshland is gone, when a storm hits, when it hits land, it's going to slow down. But the beauty about a marsh, it's like a sponge. It sucks up the water and causes less damage. But the marshes that used to be there along the coast of New Orleans were gone. And so when that storm hit, and the storm surge came, it flooded the downtown. D.C. used to get flooded, but we have what's called the tidal basin. So if you went to the cherry blossoms, that you walked along the tidal, that's a seawall, basically. All right? And again, we took away the marshes. Just thank God that the seawall is holding, and we haven't had a storm that puts water back down Constitution Avenue. Well, same thing with the storm Sandy. It eroded the beaches of the Jersey Shore. And that's because people want to put their house. If out here is the ocean, people want to put their house like right there. Versus, let's put our houses here, all right? And then you have the back bay, which is usually marshland. They've covered it over and put more houses, and so the barrier islands are going to get hit, all right? But if you've silted in the back bay, if you silted in the marsh that's between the barrier island and the mainland, then the water's going to go straight to the mainland. So we as being greedy people, we need to start thinking, do I actually need an ocean view, or can we set things back a ways and I can look out and say, oh, the ocean is there. It's only a 5-minute walk versus having your house right there at the ocean. And when a storm comes, whoops, there goes our house. Thousands of dollars.
Yeah, I wanted to, this is not as much a shared text, it's from the Talmud, so I don't know if it really answers your question for conservative Christians, but there's a story that two rabbis, or really one rabbi, is arguing against the rest of the study hall on an issue, and he's really certain that he is correct. And he says, if the law is as I say, let the rivers run in the opposite direction. And the rivers run in the opposite direction, and the other rabbis say, the law is not in the river. And so the rabbi says, okay, if the law is as I say, let the trees uproot themselves. And all the trees uproot themselves and fall over on the ground. And the other rabbis say, the law is not in the trees. So the first rabbi says, okay, if the law is as I say, let God himself come down and tell you all that I'm correct. And a voice booms out from heaven, the law is as he says. This is the ruling. And the other rabbis say, the law is not in heaven. God gave us the responsibility to take care of these things. And so I know that's a rabbinic story, but from that point on, like, we can't really rely on that God is controlling everything, that God created everything and put it in motion. And now it's up to us to continue the work of creation. So if climate change is, all the science points to human, at least exacerbation, if not complete creation, then it's up to humans to pause that damage as much as possible, undo it. So, that's a very difficult undertaking how we do that, but there's no more excuse for not trying.
Maybe one last question.
Hi, I'm Jane Hanson. I think one thing we can do is part of this because of climate change personally is just find candidates in the term, because our current administration is doing a lot of damage, and just, go with candidates that are trying to reverse these things and just make our voices heard at the ballot.
So my name is Alejandra from the Interfaith Conference in Metropolitan Washington. I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate your out-of-car experience. I happen to be a prime example of needing that. Many years ago, when I was asked by a neighbor, I was in my 20s, if I wanted to go strawberry picking. I was so exhausted from teaching, I said, I don't want to get up on the ladder and have to pick strawberries. So I agree with you. We need to take our children out. So I wanted to say, first of all, about solar. You don't necessarily have to buy solar and come up with the $30,000, $40,000. There's a way to rent solar that they can actually put it on your roof, and you can rent, and the rent is actually less than your heating bill. So that's another way that solar can be gotten. So I just wanted to share that. The other thing is, along with encouraging people to bring their own bottles. When I coordinate events now, I go to the place, the church, the synagogue, the temple, and ask them whether they have pitchers of water that we can then take the filtered water and actually pour it into the pitchers. So that's another way, to save us from having the plastic bottle. And the other thing is, I know there's Genesis 1:19 that gave us the direction to pay attention to eating the herbs, from the plants that are grown, and also the fruit. But a question to whoever's here, not only the panelists, but who's ever here, they say that when we kill animals, when we grow cows and they're using the grain, and eating the grain, isn't that harming the earth, and keeping the poor from eating the grain? And forget about the humanitarian reasons and how these animals are actually killed, which is really horrible. So I'd like to hear, first of all, if anybody knows what the statistics are with the grain that is needing to be planted to feed all these animals that could be used for feeding the poor. And the other thing is, and maybe Taliban knows this, I think that it was said that Hazrat Ali said, don't make your stomach's graveyard for animals. So that's something that I have heard. I don't know whether you have heard that either. And I know that that Muhammad, may blessings and peace be upon him, was to have said that it's very important towards how you kill the animal, but also to look the animal in the eye. And I think sometimes that's a humanitarian reason, because if you look an animal in the eye, you probably will not want to kill it. So if somebody could respond to that, I really appreciate it.
I don't have the numbers offhand, but I recently, in preparation for this, I looked up a paper I had written in rabbinical school on the topic of bal tashchit as it pertains to our meat industry. Americans eat a ridiculous amount of meat, more than any other country, and over time, our consumption of poultry has increased, but our consumption of beef and pork has not decreased proportionately, so we just keep eating more and more meat as a whole. And like I said earlier, beef especially is horrible for the environment. I'll admit, I do eat some red meat from time to time. I'm not a vegetarian myself. I was for many years. I'm not now. But I do not eat it frequently, mostly for this reason, because whole rainforests are being cleared to then make these pastures in climates that are not really made to grow grass, so that there's more room to feed the cows and process the cows and do whatever. A lot, again, I can't remember off the top of my head, but an astounding amount of fuel is used just to process the grain and transport it to, that's not even including the fuel used to process the meat and transport it out to the stores. Just to feed and keep the animals ruins farming for all other purposes. As you said, that farming could be used to produce more food for the poor, but instead we're just wasting it, essentially. And it uses up a ton of fuel, of fossil fuels, to do that, to transport it out to these remote places, because nobody wants the cow farms, and especially not the processing plants, in their backyard. So we put them out in poor areas that were previously, farm country, or like I said, rainforest, whatever, that were not as inhabited or inhabited by people that the meat industry deems disposable. So it's really a huge problem on so many levels, and then of course so much of the labor done to keep those plants running is done by, again, poor people, migrant workers, undocumented people, and then they're abused as well. And there's a lot going on that's not so ethical in our meat industry.
Thank you so much.